As we begin a new series, for me, at least I think is a good day, entitled Jesus Stories. And we're going to be in this series for several months, looking at the stories that Jesus found important to tell us in the Gospel of Matthew and as well as in the Gospel of Luke. Now, when we think about telling stories, the truth of us, all of us have some level of experience in telling stories. We're all storytellers at some level. You go to brunch later on with someone, you will tell stories. Whether it's a story about what you did or didn't like about my talk or a story about something else, you will tell a story. We tell a story all the time when we gather. And what I've noticed is this, is that the stories that we tell in individual small chunks, if we begin to pile them all together, they will tell a bigger story of our life through the series of those smaller stories. Now, if you've been here for a while, I would like to submit that you know things about me that make into a bigger story because of the smaller stories I might tell you from this place when I have the opportunity to communicate. Like, you know that I have horrible taste in professional football teams. You know this. I still cheer for them, even though it is probably not a good decision. You know that I don't like to camp. Listen, I still don't get you people who tell me that there's something glorious about waking up in the morning and coming out of a tent and looking at the lake. I don't get it. Because I say someone else has also determined that, and they built a cabin on the other side of that lake. Verbo that baby. That's not me. I don't like to camp. Not a big fan. You also know about me as a father. I tell stories about my kids, and as I've discovered, as my kids have gotten older, my concerns have not gotten less. You know stories about me because I tell stories about my wife, and she's a teacher, and how I'm fortunate to be with her. You know a bigger part of my story because God continues to work on me in so many levels of my life. If you've not heard this before from me, welcome to my confession. Most of you have heard it before, that I don't have a control problem. I have a sin problem that shows up in control. Some of you need to resonate with that. Name it for what it is. God continues to work in my life. And you over time, if you've heard some of these stories or just hearing them now, you're able to piece them together a little bit like a puzzle and have a bigger story of who I am. Because I tell stories, you tell stories. But I would like to submit, there is no greater storyteller in all of human history than Jesus. Jesus tells stories in the Gospels. And in the Gospels, as he shares a lot of these smaller stories, what he's doing for us is he's helping us put it together to know the bigger story about who he is and what he wants to say with us. And when Jesus tells a story in Scripture, hear me folks, it is important. You grasp that? It's important. But I would also like to tell you something. Just because something's important, it doesn't mean we really pay attention. Do we? I would like to submit the lady or the man standing up in front of you in the plane that you're on telling you about how to do something in an emergency that we don't pay attention to. Like, I'm sure there are words coming out of their mouth, but if you're like me, I've already got my AirPods in. I'm doing what I want to do. They're literally telling me about, in a life and death situation, what I should be doing, and I'm like, I'll just read the card on the plane going down. Some of you know what I'm talking about? Just because it's important, it doesn't mean that we listen to it. Even in a life and death situation, I want to tell you something about what we see here in Scripture, about the stories Jesus tells. Jesus says he came that we could have life and life to the full. And the enemy came to kill and to steal and destroy, so that when he reveals something through stories, it is in some ways a life and death situation. It's the difference between knowing about Jesus and really knowing Jesus. You know the difference between knowing about someone and knowing someone. And so often I'm going to ask this question in this series: what choices are you making when it comes to knowing Jesus? And when I'm talking about knowing Jesus, I'm not talking about knowing Jesus in some sort of abstract way, like we know the platform and the name of an elected official. But I'm talking about knowing him deeply. And the truth is, some of us in this series are going to have to recognize something, that we have heard these stories, but we haven't really listened to these stories. You know the difference, right? One of the main differences between really hearing and really listening is what we do with said information. For years, and I've shared this before, I would tell my wife, You haven't told me what you wanted for Christmas or birthday or Mother's Day. Warning, next week. whatever it might be. And she said, yes, I have. And I'd be like, no, you haven't. And she's like, yes, I have. Now, you've never had one of those arguments before, have you? And I would say something like this: I have never heard the words come out of your mouth, I want this for Mother's Day, or I want this for Christmas. She goes, yeah, you haven't. But how many times have I said, I like that? Or this is nice? Or what? Yeah, some of you men, you're nodding because you're with me, right? You want to hear the words, please purchase this for me. And she's like, will you just listen to the words that are coming out of my mouth? Because I'm telling you something. Sometimes we hear things, but we're not really listening. And it can be the case with some of the things we're going to talk about in the next several months. But I want to invite you to do something, to really listen. But not just listen, but to respond to these stories that in Scripture are called parables. And over these next few weeks, here's what's going to happen. As Jesus, and we study these parables that Jesus is going to tell us through Matthew and Luke, what's going to happen is that he's going to invite us into listening deeply into the bigger story he's trying to tell about himself and the world and us. So are you ready? Not a trick question. Yes. Are you ready? Yes. All right. So I invite you this morning to open up to the book of Matthew. We're going to start there in Matthew chapter 13. But what's interesting is where we're going to start this morning isn't actually a story. You're like, hold on a second. You just said we're starting a series about Jesus stories, and you're not going to talk about a story that Jesus told. Yes. Because before we get into some of the stories that Jesus tells, there's a really big question that we need to answer, and this is the question. It is the question of why. Why does Jesus do what he does? Now, when we drop ourselves into Matthew chapter 13, not only are we going to be in the middle of the chapter, we're going to be in the middle of a parable that he's going to tell about the parable of the soils that we'll deal with next week. But not only is he in the middle of telling a parable, when we're going to read from Matthew chapter 13, verse 10 to verse 17, he's been in the middle of all kinds of telling stories up to this point. And as he was telling these stories, what had happened was there was growing opposition to what Jesus was telling the people about himself and the kingdom and how they should live. So much this opposition had grown that it had become clear at this point in Matthew chapter 13 that many of the people who had heard Jesus' teachings had made a determination. And their determination was this: we're not going to follow Jesus. In fact, we want to punish him. And in this place, when we pick up in Matthew 13, the opposition is eventually going to lead to doing something that's going to fulfill a prophecy that was done 700 years before in the book of Isaiah that says that Jesus is going to be crushed for our iniquities. He's going to pay the punishment for our sins. It's going to lead him to the cross. But when we get to verse 10, what's interesting is right there in the middle of Jesus telling several parables that at this point have seemed to become hard to understand. As a result of being hard to understand what Jesus is saying, his disciples kind of stop him and ask a question: why? Why are you doing this? And this is what they say. Then the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? My hope in my heart this morning for us is that we understand the why behind what Jesus is saying. We will listen and hear in ways maybe we've not before. And so let's pray. God, my prayer is that you give us ears to hear your truth. You give us eyes to see what you want us to see. And also, God, that you open our heart in places we've closed it off to understand how you want us to live. God, I'm always smiling at the idea when I say we invite you into this space. You're already here. So it's not an invitation so much for you, but rather it's an asking for us to submit to what you want to do. May this be so. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So why is the question? But before we get to why, we probably need to first understand, at least from a biblical context, what are we saying when we talk about the stories of Jesus or parables? Now, a parable, if you just take the definition, means to set something alongside. So you need to put a mental picture in your mind that you're setting alongside another story to another situation so that in telling this story over here, you make the connection to this situation over here. When we look at parables, they were a common way for people, all people, not just Jesus, to communicate deeper meaning about something else by talking about a common experience everyone would have. And so in that scenario, then people would make the connection. We, by the way, often speak in parables. I often speak in some sort of way in parables. I like to call them illustrations. And I try to connect them to a common experience. If you were here last week in person or joined online or were able to listen at some point within the week, you know that I mentioned that just because you have been together with someone for a very, very long time doesn't mean you fully understand them. Some of you are like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Especially those that are in a marriage relationship. Or maybe you're not in a marriage relationship, just your kids, and you're still wondering. And I said this about my wife. We've been together for 25 years. I'm happy to tell you this, that this week I have moved from a 10% understanding of my wife to an 11. This is progress. She is, in many ways, a puzzle. Now, if you remember that, that is great. But I told the story for a greater reason. When Jesus shares a parable, he is telling a common experience that he's setting alongside something important that we need to know about him, about us, and the kingdom. Yet, if we don't really listen, the purpose of the parable can be missed. Much like if I asked you, great, I told you a story about how puzzling my wife is, I would want to follow up with, but why did I say that? This is not a quiz. But if you can't tell me why I said my wife was puzzling and connected to the next, I didn't do a good job as a communicator, because it wasn't about telling a good story. It was about putting an illustration alongside something to make a point. When we think about what is happening here, we need to know that we can hear the illustration, we can hear the parable if we're not careful, and miss the point. So similarly, the purpose of a parable is never the parable itself. Rather, the purpose of a parable is the good news that Jesus is pointing to about himself, to us, and the kingdom in the story that he's telling. This is important because we need to have ears to hear, eyes to see, and a heart to understand what Jesus is trying to say. And so with that background, we see the disciples ask the question, why you speak in parables, to which Jesus responds. Verse 11, and he answered them, to you it has been given to know the secrets, or as some of your versions say, mysteries, and I'll talk about this in a second, of the kingdom of heaven. But to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, in hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed. When we look into the Gospels, sometimes the purpose and the reason for parables are very clear. Probably one of the most famous parables that you will be familiar with is the parable of the Good Samaritan. We've talked about it here at the church before. When the teacher of the law said, who is my neighbor? Jesus responded by telling him the story or the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then he said, who was the one that was a good neighbor? And he said, the one that showed him mercy, the Samaritan. And he says what? Go and do likewise. So when we look and when we see that, in that case, what's happening is there's an explanation. But what happens now, once we start getting to Matthew chapter 13, is a little bit different. And some of the parables that we're going to talk about are a little bit different. Because what's happening here is that Jesus seems, in telling the parables here in Matthew 13, to be intentionally vague. Have you just ever, done a double take when you've read something or saw something like, well, that doesn't seem to really make sense? If you've read this and thought, this doesn't seem to make sense, I want you to know you're not alone. Because Jesus is saying this very quickly, but very clearly, that I'm speaking in parables so that for those who have ears to hear, they will get more light. And for those who don't, they will remain in the dark. I'm going to enlighten some people to the secrets or the mysteries of the kingdom, and for others, they're going to be in dark. Now, when I look at this at first, maybe you do like, well, what gives? Why would Jesus do this? This could at first glance seem unkind or ungraceful at first, right? Why would Jesus ever want to keep anyone in the dark? Hold that, because before we get to that, we need to answer something else. What are these secrets or what are these mysteries? Now, first I want to tell you what they're not. We won't get deeply into this, but there was a heresy that would come out later, especially in the church in Galatia and others, called as Gnosticism, wherein people would begin to think that they had a special divine revelation word mysteries. But both the word secret and the word mysteries in our context probably conjure up some things that aren't truly accurate to what it means in the text. So hear me say this. In the New Testament, the term mysterion, which is the term here for secrets or mystery, is more of a theological term that's applied to a piece of information that is now given to enhance an old piece of information. It is a new revelation, so to speak, of some old aspect, maybe in the Old Testament, that is now revealed. So when we think of it this way, it's not new words or concepts, it's just finally now beginning to understand the depths of the words that were spoken before. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, let me set something alongside that story by telling you another story. So my son is 14 now, and if you saw him, you would never know exactly what he looked like as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old boy. But I don't know if you've ever seen a head-heavy, big-headed 2-year-old, 3-year-old boy. Have you seen them? They run around with no sense of danger and no sense of balance. I don't believe there's very many pictures at all that were happening at 2 and 3 years old of my son where there wasn't some sort of bruise in his facial area. I remember one point he fell forward and lost his balance, and I don't even know how it was humanly possible. He caught the edge of a cabinet on our kitchen island. He had a goose egg big enough to scare the living daylights out of his mom and I. And he just went on like nothing was happening. And so what would happen was he began to fall down enough that I started sort of saying something when he fell down. So when my son was 2 years old or those sort of things and 3 years old, when he fell, I would do this. Down goes Frazier. Now for some of you, you immediately get that context. For those of you of not my particular age, you have no idea where that comes from. The statement, down goes Frazier, is probably one of the most famous utterances ever given by a sportscaster in all of human history. His name was Howard Cosell, and he said it in the year of our Lord, 1973. 1973, when George Foreman hit Joe Frazier hard enough to knock him out. And down goes Frazier. But here's the thing. That's just what I started saying. So that my son, when he was 2 and 3, without even realizing it, he would fall, and before I would say it, he'd go, down goes Frazier. Did he understand the context in the Old Testament way? Yes, he did. It wasn't until later on that I pulled up YouTube and I go, by the way, here's the full understanding of what I kept saying to you. It's not just you just fell, here's the context. Now, are you putting this all together? This is key to what's happening here. Jesus is telling more about the kingdom, fleshing out some context of the Old Testament now in the New Testament. And only those who had ears to hear and eyes to see and hearts to understand, who would engage the YouTube video, would be people who would get it. But there would be people who would not get it. Why? Because the stories that Jesus tells in Matthew and Luke, these parables, are actually an invitation to people. As he tells them, it's an invitation for them to listen or not to listen. Not just to hear, but to listen. To engage or disengage from deeper understanding about what Jesus wants to know. And for those who chose to engage the mysteries of the secrets of how Jesus was giving greater explanation of how we, on this side of eternity, can have life and life to the full, they were rewarded. To those who chose not to engage, already, because remember, so many of them up until this point to Matthew 13 had now become hostile. Those stories would remain a mystery. So he changed the way that he was talking about parables here in Matthew chapter 13 and how he was giving parables, so that the disciples asked this question: why are you speaking in parables? And the answer is that so that some people would be enlightened if they truly listened, and some people would stay in the dark, which brings me to this truth. Jesus was not being vague to be unkind. At this point, he began to honor the choices that people had already made. Hold on to that. When Jesus began to speak in parables this way, he's not being vague to be unkind. He was actually honoring their choices that people had made. That's why he spoke in parables. Verse 14 also tells us that one of the reasons he spoke in parables is that it's a direct quote of a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 6. In Isaiah, there's a vision where God reveals Israel will not hear a message. And this is what's happening now. Much more can be said about Isaiah chapter 6. We don't have time to dive into today, but rather this is the basic why of parables, which we need to know as we dive into what we're going to do over these next many weeks. But now look at how Jesus makes this connection between 700 years ago and when he's speaking somewhere around AD 30. He says this, verse 15. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their eyes they can barely hear. And their eyes, they've been closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed, this is the same words we use in the Beatitudes. Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. The book of Isaiah was penned some 700 years before when Jesus is speaking this to the disciples. And even though 700 years ago this cycle had happened, we now see the same scenario repeating itself in many people's lives that Jesus was speaking to. Their hearts had grown dull. Their ears had become closed off. Their eyes wouldn't see the truth that he was presenting to them, and so they weren't turning to the truth of what Jesus was saying. They may have heard, but they weren't listening. But for those who were listening, like the disciples, and leaned in to understand the greater story Jesus was trying to tell them about his kingdom, they would be blessed by that. They would be able to live the life and the life to the full that Jesus said he came for in John chapter 10. In many ways, it was a life and death scenario. Will the enemy win to kill, to steal, and destroy, or will they live from the life and the life to the full? It had a lot to do with how it's listening here. Simply put, Jesus is highlighting this. Don't miss this. Jesus is highlighting the responsibility each person has, both then and now, in making a choice of whether we will just hear what he has to say or we will actually listen to what he has to say and follow his teachings. Which brings us to today. Some things for us, right? I mean, we're now like 2,000 years removed from Matthew 13, 2,700 years removed from Isaiah chapter 6. Can we be truthful though, right? Don't you think that cycle's still here? That we close off our ears, we shut our eyes, we don't have hearts to understand. And Scripture says that Jesus, God, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so if Jesus was not being vague to be unkind back there, he was honoring their choices then, know this: Jesus still honors our choices. I think this is a really interesting one for us, because it talks about this interplay of our decisions and what he allows to happen. Imagine you're going 60 and a 35. For some of you, you're like, I can imagine that easily. But the police officer pulls you over, and you start blaming the police officer for the ticket he's given you. The truth is, he or she who pulled you over is really just honoring the choice that you made to go 60 in the 35, right? But we want to put it on him. My wife's a teacher. I'm not sure what has happened now, but when I was a kid, it was always the kid's fault. For a lot of parents now, it's always the teacher's fault. And so sometimes someone will complain about a grade that they got. And it wasn't that my wife gave them a bad grade. She was honoring their choice for not doing the work. I want you to think about that in light of what Jesus does with us. Day in and day out, folks, we make choices, knowingly or unknowingly. We make them to open our ears to hear, open our eyes to see, make our hearts available to understand, or we make them to close our eyes to see, or to shut off our ears and say, we don't want to understand more. And the pattern of God through Scripture is this, is that he does call us to come to him. But eventually, if we continue to push him away, he will honor our choice. Maybe one of the first and most powerful ways that you see this is when we were talking recently about the plagues that hit the Egyptians. If you read the plagues that came to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, you will see that God's initial desire, as I've said before, was to draw them to change in their repentance. It was only after Pharaoh continually said, no, I'm shutting my ears, I'm closing my eyes, and I will not have a heart to understand, till God then honors his choice and hardens Pharaoh's heart. It didn't start without God trying to draw Pharaoh in. By the way, it's important that when we read Matthew chapter 13, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It's not like Jesus started speaking this way, completely vague from the beginning. Rather, what he was doing in this moment was honoring the choice that people made. Romans chapter 1, verse 24 is a verse you can read where it says that eventually God turned people over to the desires that they had. The implication of that verse is that for so long he was withholding it, but they said, hey, I want to keep going, I want to keep doing this. He's like, all right, you do you. But there are consequences in that. And what I want us to hear is that when Jesus is saying these words to the disciples, the audience he was most talking to, who didn't have ears to hear and eyes to see and hearts to understand, were the religious people of the day. Matter of fact, if you ask them, those religious people of the day, they probably thought they had it all together. Yet they were standing in front of who Jesus was, telling them the truth about kingdoms, and they could hear, but they were not listening. And so I want to say this, folks, is that God still honors our choices. And if you're here this morning or you're watching online and you might begin to wonder, has God been honoring some choices I make? Instead of having to live in fear about that, you can go to God and say, God, have I been shutting my eyes, closing off my ears, turning my heart to you? If that's so, help me change. Help me not just to hear, but to listen and follow. Because here's the second truth we need to know, that Jesus reveals truth to be lived, not just to be known. The stuff that he's going to tell us in these parables isn't for our intellectual stimulation. It is to be applied. When we look in verse 15, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, but it's important to repeat. When it says the word hear in verse 15, when it brings up that idea over and over again of hearing, it's not, again, just knowing information, but it extends to the idea of listening, understanding, and acting on the truth that's being spoken. As I said earlier, right, just because something is important, it doesn't mean we actually act on it. Just because the airline steward or flight attendant or stewardess, whatever they call them today, is standing up there doing this, I'm still not exactly sure, right? And mentioning some card and talking about in case of an emergency, something drops out of the ceiling. It doesn't mean that we're really listening. And some of you are like, well, Brian, you were really listening. You just gave it to me. No, I had an illustration I had to make. Like if you would have asked me before this all the things that they really said, I probably couldn't put it back to you. Now, for us, that might seem a little crazy, but it really is the life and death stuff that they're telling us about. And I want us to hear this, that knowing about life and death things without listening and following about life and death things do us no good. That the point of these stories, the point of these parables isn't just for us to hear them in our language and say, I can report them back to you what it says in the parable of the sowers or so many of the other parables that we're going to cover, but rather it's for us to respond. And how we respond to these stories that we're going to study about Jesus and the stories he tells about us and about himself and the kingdom is the difference between how we actually know about someone and we really know someone. As we dive into this series, we're going to look at many, many stories of Jesus. And we're going to hear many truths, by the way, that for those who had ears to hear and listen in the New Testament, that people in the Old Testament would have loved the privilege of knowing some of this stuff. And now Jesus in his kindness and his goodness is going to reveal them, the things that so many of the past wish, and he's going to reveal them in parables. So that in the parables that we look at in all these smaller stories over the next month, we can put together to have a bigger story. And through the smaller stories, we understand more about his kingdom. But I want us to hear this, that the parables are this. They're an invitation. An invitation Jesus is making to us to engage or disengage. To really have ears to hear and eyes to see and hearts to understand, or to choose the opposite. Because we still have to make a choice. And Jesus still honors our choices. And will we engage what Jesus is telling about himself and us? Or we close our ears and eyes? Will our hearts be hardened? So before I pray this morning, here's the question again. What choices are you making when it comes to knowing Jesus? Father God, we're grateful and we're thankful for our time together we've had in this text. We're grateful and thankful to the fact that you have invested in us by sending Jesus. And God, that you continue to invest us by putting your very Spirit inside of us to make a change. So God, open our eyes, open our ears, and open our hearts to that which you want to tell us. But then God, let it not just be something that we intellectually know. But let it be something that we do. And we follow. We love you. In Jesus' name.